Keanu Reeves stepped into the small, bustling market, the scent of freshly baked bread and neatly arranged fruits filling the air as he blended into the crowd. Customers moved through the aisles, chatting or comparing prices, oblivious to the life-changing moment that was about to unfold. Dressed simply in a casual jacket and sunglasses, he appeared as just another shopper, an unassuming presence in a world that had no idea who was watching. Near the checkout, Peter adjusted his uniform, his hands trembling slightly. Today was his first day at work, and he wanted nothing more than to prove himself. He had always been eager to help, but years of being underestimated left him questioning his abilities. His stepfather's cruel words echoed in his head, warnings that he would never be good enough. But Peter refused to let those words define him. He greeted customers with a warm, albeit nervous smile, carefully scanning and bagging items. Some noticed his slower pace, but most simply appreciated his sincerity. Others, however, were less patient. That was when she arrived. The automatic doors slid open, announcing the arrival of Karen, a woman whose presence demanded attention. She was in her mid-40s, with short, sharp blonde hair and an expression of perpetual dissatisfaction. Dressed in expensive heels and a designer purse slung over her shoulder, she carried herself with an air of superiority. As she strutted through the store, her heels clicked against the polished tiles, a rhythmic warning of impending trouble. She moved through the aisles, tossing items into her cart with an entitled indifference. A child accidentally stepped in her way, and she scoffed, muttering something about untrained brats. By the time she reached the checkout line, her impatience was already at its peak. Peter glanced up as she stepped forward, her cold gaze locking on to him. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted politely, his voice carrying a hopeful tremor. Karen didn't respond. Instead, she rolled her eyes and began slamming her items onto the counter. The force of her movements sent a can rolling to the edge, nearly falling off. Peter quickly reached out, catching it just in time. She scoffed. "Ha! Oh great, a slow one." Her voice was loud enough for the customers behind her to hear. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Peter swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the can as he set it aside and continued scanning. He tried to work faster, but his nervous fingers fumbled with the bags. Karen let out an exaggerated sigh. "Are you serious? This is taking forever." I'm sorry," Peter stammered. "I'll be done soon." "Oh, I doubt that," Karen muttered. "This is a fast lane." "What part of fast don't you understand?" Peter's ears burned. He glanced around, hoping for some form of support, but his manager, Jack, was across the store, oblivious to the scene unfolding. Keanu Reeves, however, was not. From a few feet away, he watched the interaction with growing concern. He had seen his fair share of cruelty in Hollywood: heartless directors, ego-driven celebrities, ruthless journalists. But there was something about this moment that struck a nerve. The power imbalance, the demeaning words. It was too familiar. And then it got worse. Peter, in his rush to bag the groceries, accidentally let a loaf of bread slip from his hands. It fell to the ground, landing with a soft thud. Karen gasped dramatically. "Oh my God, he can't even hold a bag!" Laughter, cruel and sharp, escaped her lips. A few customers behind her exchanged glances, some embarrassed for her, others simply uncomfortable. Peter bent down quickly, his fingers trembling as he reached for the bread. His vision blurred as humiliation clawed at him. This was just like before, just like his stepfather's cruel taunts. "You'll never be anything, boy. Just give up." He bit the inside of his cheek, forcing back the lump in his throat. Karen wasn't finished. She turned to the customers behind her, throwing her arms up in exaggerated frustration. "Are we seriously all going to pretend this is normal? This level of incompetence?" She gestured at Peter as if he were a spectacle. "Someone needs to tell him the truth. He shouldn't be working here." A few murmurs rippled through the line. Some people shuffled their feet, unwilling to look at Peter. Others held up their phones, recording the moment. Peter's breathing grew uneven, his fingers curled into fists at his sides. And then the footsteps. Firm, measured, unshaken. Keanu Reeves stepped forward. A hush fell over the market. The murmurs died down. Karen, who had been reveling in the attention, turned to face the unexpected interruption. Keanu's expression was unreadable, but his presence alone shifted the energy in the air. The weight of his gaze was enough to make Karen take an involuntary step back. "That's enough," he said, his voice calm but firm. Karen blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes steady. "You heard me." A few customers gasped quietly. Others whispered among themselves. Karen scoffed, regaining her composure. "And who do you think you are, stepping into a conversation that doesn't involve you?" Keanu smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just a guy who believes in treating people with respect." Karen crossed her arms. "Oh, please. I have every right to be upset. This kid is wasting everyone's time." Keanu's gaze flickered to Peter. He could see the way the young man was gripping the counter, as if holding onto it for dear life. He turned back to Karen. "You have the right to be frustrated," he admitted, "but you don't have the right to humiliate him for it." Karen let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, great, now I'm getting lectured by—" She stopped, finally taking in his face. Her eyes widened. "Wait, you're— Keanu simply raised an eyebrow. The realization spread through the crowd like wildfire. Whispers turned to gasps. "Oh my God, that's Keanu Reeves!" Is he serious right now? This is insane. Karen's posture stiffened. Her arrogance wavered, but she quickly masked it. "I don't care who you are. This has nothing to do with you." Keanu took a slow step forward, lowering his voice just enough to make everyone lean in. "It has everything to do with me when I see someone being treated unfairly." The weight of his words pressed down on Karen. She shifted uncomfortably, glancing around at the crowd that was no longer on her side. For the first time, she was the one feeling small. Keanu turned back to Peter. "What's your name?" he asked gently. Peter hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Peter." Keanu nodded. "Peter, you're doing a great job." He placed a hand on Peter's shoulder, steady and reassuring. "Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Peter's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, his chest swelling with something unfamiliar. Confidence. Keanu then turned back to Karen. "You don't have to apologize," he said. "But you do have to leave. You do have to leave. You do have to leave." Karen opened her mouth to argue but found herself at a loss for words. The weight of the stairs around her was suffocating. People were still recording. This would be online within the hour. Defeated, she huffed and grabbed her groceries. "Unbelievable," she muttered under her breath before storming toward the exit. As the automatic doors slid open and swallowed her whole, the tension in the air finally broke. A customer in the back clapped. Then another, and another. Soon the market erupted into applause. Peter, overwhelmed, could only stare at Keanu. Keanu simply smiled. "Keep being yourself," he said, "because who you are is already enough." And just like that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind a story that would be told for years to come. Keanu's steps were measured as he made his way toward the exit, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the charged energy still lingering in the market. The moment he had intervened felt monumental to those present, but to him, it was simply a matter of doing what was right. Peter stood frozen behind the counter, his heart pounding. He could still feel the warmth of Keanu's reassuring hand on his shoulder, a gesture that had felt more powerful than any words ever spoken to him before. He wasn't sure how to process what had just happened. The other customers in line, once hesitant to react, now looked at him with new eyes. Where there had been pity, now there was respect. A woman stepped forward, her voice kind. "You handled that well, young man." Peter blinked at her. I did?" She smiled. "You stayed strong even when she was trying to tear you down. That's more than most people can say." Another man, older with silver hair, placed a few items on the counter and nodded toward Peter. "That took guts, son. I've seen grown men crack under less pressure than that." Peter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hands still trembled slightly as he resumed scanning groceries, but the weight that had settled over him earlier was now lifting. Jack, the manager, had finally made his way over, having missed most of the confrontation, but catching enough whispers to know something significant had happened. He placed a firm but gentle hand on Peter's back. "You okay, kid?" Peter nodded slowly. "I think so." Jack let out a chuckle. You just had Keanu Reeves defend you in front of a packed store. If you ask me, you might be the luckiest employee in the country right now." A customer in the line piped up. "It's already online, too. Look." She turned her phone toward them, revealing a freshly uploaded video that had already garnered thousands of views. The headline read, "Keanu Reeves defends grocery store employee from rude customer, true class act." The screen showed a frozen frame of Keanu standing firmly between Karen and Peter, his hand outstretched as if drawing a line that couldn't be crossed. Another customer chuckled. "You'll be famous by the end of the day, Peter." Peter's cheeks flushed. "I don't know about that." But it was too late. The momentum had already begun. Across the world, people were already reacting. In a corporate office in Los Angeles, an assistant knocked on a door and stepped inside. "Sir, you need to see this." Her boss, a well-dressed man in his 40s, looked up from his laptop, annoyed at the interruption. "What is it?" She handed him a tablet. "Keanu Reeves just defended a grocery store employee with Down syndrome from a rude customer. It's blowing up." The man's expression shifted as he watched the clip, his usual businesslike demeanor replaced by something softer. "This kid," he shook his head. "This is something special." In a high school cafeteria in Ohio, a group of students huddled together over a phone. "Dude, look at this," one of them said, showing the video. "Keanu Reeves just shut down some Karen for bullying this guy." A girl in the group watched the video and then, with a thoughtful look, turned to her friend, who had always been a little different from the others. "Hey, you know you can sit with us, right?" The friend hesitated before nodding, a small, grateful smile forming on his lips. In a cozy suburban home, a mother sat on the couch, tears pricking at her eyes as she watched the clip. Her son, a 10-year-old boy with Down syndrome, sat beside her, playing with his toy cars. She glanced at him, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and worry. She took a deep breath. "You know, sweetheart, you're capable of amazing things. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." The little boy grinned up at her. "Like Peter?" she smiled. "Exactly like Peter." Back in the grocery store, Peter was still adjusting to the sudden shift in the way people saw him. Before today, he had worried about being invisible, about being overlooked. Now, people wanted to shake his hand, commend him for his patience, tell him he had inspired them in ways he could hardly understand. A teenage girl approached shyly. "Peter, can I take a picture with you?" Peter's eyes widened. "Me?" She nodded. "Yeah, you're kind of a hero now." He hesitated before nodding. "Okay." As they took the picture, Jack clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You're gonna need a break, kid. Go take 5. Peter nodded, stepping away from the checkout line and heading toward the break room. He barely made it to the back before his legs gave out beneath him. He sat heavily on the bench, his head spinning. The weight of the day hit him all at once. He had started the morning terrified that he wouldn't be good enough, that he'd mess up, that people would look at him and only see his differences. Now, the entire world was looking at him, but not because he was different. Because he was strong, because he had stood there, taken every cruel word Karen had thrown at him, and refused to break. A notification dinged on his phone. He fished it out of his pocket, hands still shaking, and saw an unfamiliar message request. "Hey Peter, I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. You did great today. Hope you're proud of yourself. You should be." Peter stared at the screen, rereading the message over and over again. A tear slipped down his cheek, but this time it wasn't from sadness. He wiped his face and typed out a reply. "Thank you. I think for the first time I am." As he hit send, something inside him shifted. The world had changed today, and so had he. Several days had passed since the incident at the grocery store, yet its impact continued to ripple far beyond the market's aisles. Social media platforms buzzed with discussions about kindness, patience, and the quiet strength that Peter had demonstrated in the face of cruelty. News outlets picked up the story, interviews were requested, and people from all over the world sent messages of support. Peter, however, was still adjusting to the newfound attention. For years, he had struggled with being overlooked, with feeling like he didn't quite fit in. Now, he found himself in the unfamiliar position of being seen, really seen. At first, it was overwhelming. Customers recognized him, often stopping to shake his hand or share their own stories of overcoming hardship. Some brought small tokens of appreciation, homemade cookies, encouraging notes, even small donations toward his future. Others simply offered kind words, the type of compassion he never expected from strangers. One afternoon, as he stocked a shelf in the cereal aisle, an elderly man with a cane approached him. His voice was warm, carrying the wisdom of many years. "You remind me of my grandson," he said. "He had Down syndrome too. People underestimated him all the time, but he never let that stop him. Neither should you." Peter looked up, touched by the words. "What did he do?" The man smiled. "He became a teacher. And you? You're already teaching the world something important." The words stayed with him long after the man walked away. Meanwhile, Jack, the store manager, had been dealing with an influx of reporters hoping to speak with Peter. He turned most of them away, knowing the young man wasn't looking for fame. However, there was one request that he couldn't ignore. A representative from a foundation dedicated to supporting individuals with disabilities had reached out, offering Peter an opportunity to speak at an upcoming event, not for publicity, but to share his experience in a way that could inspire others. Jack approached Peter about it in the break room, uncertain of how he'd respond. "You don't have to say yes," Jack assured him, "but they think your story could help a lot of people." Peter considered the idea carefully. The thought of speaking in front of a crowd made his stomach twist with nerves, but then he remembered Keanu's words, that his worth wasn't defined by how quickly he bagged groceries, but by who he was. Maybe this was his chance to show the world exactly that. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." When the day of the event arrived, Peter found himself standing backstage, heart pounding as he peeked out at the audience. Rows of people filled the auditorium, students, parents, advocates, and individuals with disabilities who had come to hear his story. The sight of so many eyes waiting for him made his hands tremble. A gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "You'll do great, Peter." He turned to see Keanu Reeves standing beside him, a warm smile on his face. Peter's eyes widened. You came?" Keanu chuckled. "Of course, you didn't think I'd miss this, did you?" Peter swallowed the lump in his throat. "I'm really nervous," Keanu nodded. "That just means you care, and that's a good thing." Peter took another deep breath. Then, as his name was called, he stepped onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause, but he barely heard it over the sound of his own heartbeat. He stood at the podium, hands gripping the edges, searching for the words that would help him make sense of everything. For a moment, the doubts crept in. Would they really care what he had to say? Would his words make a difference? Then, he thought back to that day in the grocery store, the way Karen had tried to make him feel small, and the way Keanu had reminded him that he wasn't. He straightened his posture and took a steady breath. "I used to think that being different meant I wasn't good enough," he began, his voice quiet but steady. "I spent a lot of my life believing that I had to prove something to people who didn't believe in me. But I was wrong." He glanced at the audience, seeing faces filled with encouragement, with understanding. "I'm not here because of what happened in the grocery store. I'm here because of what happened after. Because of the people who reminded me that kindness is more powerful than cruelty, that respect matters, that we matter." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "I know that I'm not the only one who's ever felt like they weren't good enough. And I know there are a lot of people out there who need to hear this. You don't have to be faster, stronger, or smarter than anyone else to be worth something. You already are." The room was silent for a moment. Then, as if a wave had washed over the audience, the applause began. Soft at first, then growing until the entire auditorium was standing. Peter felt a warmth spread through his chest, the kind of pride that came not from proving something to others, but from finally believing it for himself. As he stepped away from the podium, Keanu was waiting for him. "You crushed it," he said, clapping Peter on the back. Peter grinned, and for the first time in his life, he truly believed it. What had started as a day of humiliation had turned into something far greater, a movement, a message, a moment that would change lives, not just his, but so many others. And as he looked out at the crowd, he realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As Peter stepped off the stage, a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion settled over him. The applause still echoed in his ears. But what struck him most was the flood of people waiting for him. Some clutched notebooks, eager to share their own stories. Others wiped away tears, visibly moved by his words. The first to approach was a woman with soft eyes and streaks of silver in her dark hair. "My son has Down syndrome," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He's in high school and he's been struggling. Seeing you up there, it gives me hope." Peter nodded, his own eyes misting over. "Tell him to keep going," he said, "no matter what people say." She squeezed his hand. "I will." Next was a young man in a wheelchair, his expression determined. "I have cerebral palsy," he said. "People think I can't do things, but I can. Your story reminded me of that." Peter grinned. "You already know the truth," he said. "And now the world will too." As more people came forward, each with their own battles, their own fears, Peter realized something profound. This moment wasn't just about what had happened in the grocery store, nor was it just about him. It was about all of them, the people who had been silenced, overlooked, underestimated. Keanu watched from a short distance, smiling as he saw Peter interact with those who now looked up to him. He had stepped in that day at the grocery store simply because it was the right thing to do, but he hadn't expected it to create this kind of impact. It was a reminder that even the smallest moments of kindness could ripple into something much bigger. As the event wound down, Jack approached Peter with a look of pride. "You handled that like a pro," he said, clapping a hand on Peter's back. "I hope you're ready for more of this." Peter frowned. "More?" Jack grinned. "The foundation that invited you today, they want to partner with you for a national campaign on workplace inclusion." Peter's eyes widened. "You mean, like, more speeches?" "Not just speeches," Jack said. "Videos, interviews, even visits to businesses to talk about how people with disabilities deserve opportunities just like everyone else." The idea of traveling, speaking, and being in the spotlight made Peter's nerves tingle. But then he thought of all the people who had approached him today, all the people who needed to hear what he had to say. He took a deep breath and nodded. "I'll do it." Keanu, who had been listening nearby, smiled. "You're going to change lives, Peter." Peter smiled back. "I think I already have." The following weeks were a whirlwind. Peter found himself in places he had never imagined. Conference rooms filled with business executives, schools where students hung on to his every word, and even television studios where he was interviewed about his experience. Each time he spoke, the nerves were there. But with each word he shared, he felt them melt away. This wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about showing the world what was possible. One evening, as Peter sat in his room going through messages on his phone, a video call request popped up. Keanu Reeves. His breath caught. He hesitated for only a moment before answering. "Peter," Keanu greeted, his face appearing on the screen with an easy smile. "How's the superstar doing?" Peter chuckled. "I wouldn't call myself that." "Millions of people might disagree with you," Keanu said. "I saw your interview last night. You spoke from the heart. It was incredible." Peter looked down, suddenly shy. "I never thought I'd be doing any of this." Keanu nodded. "Funny how life surprises us, isn't it?" Peter hesitated before asking, "Did you ever feel like you weren't good enough?" Keanu's expression turned thoughtful. "All the time," he admitted. "There were people in Hollywood who told me I wouldn't make it, that I didn't fit their mold. I almost believed them, but I kept going. And you know what? I found my own path." Peter listened intently. "So, even you had doubts?" Keanu chuckled. "More than I can count. But the trick is to move forward anyway." Peter nodded slowly. "That's what I want to do. Keep moving forward." Keanu grinned. "Then you're already on the right track." Months passed, and Peter's life continued to change in ways he never expected. He was no longer just the young man who had been humiliated by a rude customer. He was now a symbol of resilience, an advocate for inclusion, a voice for those who had been ignored for too long. He traveled to different cities, met people who shared their own struggles, and helped shift perceptions in places that had once been reluctant to embrace change. Employers who had never considered hiring people with disabilities were now opening their doors. Schools were implementing programs to support students who faced similar challenges. One day, as Peter stood before yet another audience, preparing to speak, He caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd, his mother. Tears welled up in her eyes as she watched him, her hands clasped together. She had always believed in him, even when the world doubted him, and now she was witnessing the truth unfold. Her son was making a difference. As he took the stage, he met her gaze and gave her a small nod. This wasn't just about one moment in a grocery store anymore. It was about a movement, a mission, a new future, and Peter was ready for whatever came next. As Peter's journey continued, he found himself navigating new challenges, opportunities, and personal growth that he never thought possible. Each city he visited, each speech he gave, and each person he met added another layer to his understanding of the world and, more importantly, himself. One of the most significant changes in his life came in the form of an invitation, one that made his hands tremble as he read the email. TEDx conference invitation. The words leaped off the screen. Someone had seen his story and wanted him to deliver a TEDx talk about resilience, workplace inclusion, and overcoming doubt. He reread the message a dozen times, each time convincing himself that it wasn't real. But when Jack confirmed it with a knowing smile, reality sank in. "This is huge," Jack said, placing a reassuring hand on Peter's shoulder. "But don't let it overwhelm you. Just be yourself. That's what people want to hear." Peter had given plenty of speeches before, but this was different. TEDx talks were seen worldwide. It wasn't just a conference or a community gathering. This was a platform where ideas changed lives. For weeks, he prepared. He wrote, rewrote, practiced in front of a mirror, and even called Keanu for advice. "You're overthinking it," Keanu told him over a video call. "Remember, you're not trying to impress anyone. You're just sharing what you know, what you've lived." Peter sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I want to do it right." Keanu smiled. "You already are." The day of the TEDx event arrived quicker than Peter had anticipated. He stood backstage, feeling the familiar churn of nervous energy in his stomach. The audience was larger than any he had spoken to before, and the thought of standing on that stage made his heart pound. A soft voice broke through his anxiety. "You got this." Peter turned to see his mother standing nearby, her hands clasped in front of her. She had made it all the way here just to see him speak. Peter took a deep breath, nodded, and stepped onto the stage. The lights were bright, the auditorium silent. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, waiting. He gripped the edges of the podium. "I used to think being different was a disadvantage," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I thought that if I wasn't fast enough, strong enough, or smart enough, I wouldn't matter." A hush fell over the audience. Then one day I met someone who reminded me that my worth isn't measured by how quickly I bag groceries, that my value isn't defined by what people assume about me. He looked up, scanning the crowd, and I realized something. The world doesn't change when the loudest voices speak. It changes when the quiet ones refuse to be silenced. The audience listened, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. Peter continued, his voice growing stronger with every word. "I know what it's like to be underestimated. I know what it's like to hear people whisper, to feel like you have to work twice as hard just to prove you belong. But what I want you to know is this. Belonging isn't something you earn, it's something you own." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. "If you take nothing else from my story, take this. When you stand up for yourself, when you stand up for others, you are already changing the world." A beat of silence. Then applause. A roar of claps and cheers filled the auditorium, rising to a standing ovation. Peter exhaled, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. He had done it. As he stepped off the stage, his mother embraced him tightly. "I am so proud of you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Peter smiled, his heart swelling with something new. Something bigger than pride, a sense of purpose. The days following the TEDx talk were a whirlwind. The video was uploaded online and within days had amassed millions of views. Messages flooded in from people across the world. Parents of children with disabilities, employees who had once faced discrimination, strangers who had simply been moved by his words. One message in particular stood out. It was from a CEO of a major retail chain. "We saw your TEDx talk," the message read. "We want to do better. Can you help us?" Peter stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Was this really happening? With a deep breath, He typed out a reply. Yes, let's make it happen. Weeks later, Peter found himself in a sleek corporate office, sitting across from a group of executives. They had watched his talk, seen his story, and now wanted to implement real changes in their hiring and training processes. "So Peter," one of them said, leaning forward, "where do we start?" Peter straightened his shoulders. "We start with listening," he said. He shared his experiences, the challenges people with disabilities faced in the workplace, the unconscious biases that often kept them from opportunities. The executives nodded, taking notes, asking questions. By the end of the meeting, they had committed to creating new programs that would provide better training, accessibility, and job opportunities for people of all abilities. As Peter left the building that day, he realized something. This wasn't just about telling his story anymore. It was about rewriting the stories of countless others. His journey had started with a moment of humiliation, but now it was a movement. Months later, as Peter walked through a store that had implemented his workplace inclusion program, he saw something that made his chest tighten with emotion. A young employee, wearing a name tag similar to his own, stood at the checkout counter scanning items with care. Peter watched as an impatient customer let out a sigh, shifting from foot to foot, and then something incredible happened. Another customer turned and said, "Take your time, man, no rush." The sighing customer hesitated, then nodded, seeming to reconsider. Peter's throat tightened. This was what change looked like. Not in grand speeches, not in viral videos, but in small moments. Moments where people chose kindness, where patience won over frustration, where someone like him didn't have to feel like they were a burden, where they simply belonged. Peter stepped forward, ready to introduce himself to the young employee, to offer the same words of encouragement that Keanu had once given him. But before he could speak, the young man looked up, smiled, and said, "Hey, I know you. You're Peter." Peter blinked, surprised. "You do?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, I saw your video. You helped me believe I could do this." Peter felt his breath hitch. This was what it was all about. Not fame, not recognition, just knowing that because of one moment in a grocery store, someone else felt like they mattered. Peter smiled, shaking the young man's hand. "I'm glad you're here." And for the first time in his life, Peter knew, with absolute certainty, he was exactly where he was meant to be, too. Thanks for watching. There's another incredible video waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next.